Have you ever wondered what life truly felt like behind the shining armor of a medieval knight? Could their legends survive the blood and fears they faced every day? In this 7-chapter journey, we will strip away the myths and dive into the relentless training yards, the roar of battlefields, the whispered intrigues of court, and the lonely nights of doubt. You'll hear of honor's burdens, love's sacrifices, and the ever-looming specter of death. Stay with me until the final chapter, where you will uncover the darkest secret knights never spoke of. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: Becoming the Blade. Before a knight ever touched real steel, he first had to survive the grindstone. Not of iron, but of life. For every man in shining armor, there was once a boy trembling in the cold, gripping a wooden sword with raw, blistered hands. The path to knighthood did not begin with glory. It began with obedience. At just 7 years old, noble sons were torn from their mothers and placed in unfamiliar halls, stripped of comfort and privilege. They became pages, servants in other men's castles, learning not just manners but humility. Every misstep was met with discipline. Every chore, a lesson in endurance. By 14, if they proved worthy, they were elevated to squires. And that was when the real suffering began. Training was brutal, pain was constant, and the only reward was another day to prove they belonged. The armor they dreamed of wearing was still years away, and many never lived long enough to earn it. At dawn, the training yard came alive with echoes of shouts and clashing wood. Squires woke before the sun and staggered to the courtyard on stiff legs. Their limbs ached from yesterday's drills, but the masters showed no mercy. Wooden swords slammed into bruised ribs. Shields weighed down trembling arms. They fought blindfolded, barefoot, or against 2 opponents at once. There were no shortcuts, only suffering. While common folk learned trades, squires studied war. They memorized castle defenses, the anatomy of horses, the hierarchy of the realm. But all knowledge took a back seat to combat. Pain was their tutor, and discipline their only friend. After training, they polished their knight's gear until it shone like silver. They fetched water, cleaned horses, and endured scorn from elder warriors. No task was too low. No mistake went unnoticed. Still, deep down, every squire dreamed of one thing: earning their place in the saddle with a sword that could truly kill. But it was not just the body that needed forging. The mind had to be sharpened as well. A squire had to know when to strike and when to bow, when to act without hesitation and when to endure without complaint. Pride was beaten out of them early. Arrogance could get a man killed, and a dead squire was just another lesson for the living. Fear, too, was a constant companion. The fear of failing, the fear of disgrace, and most of all, the fear that when the time came, their blade would falter. They trained until their arms were numb, then trained again. Every bruise was a badge, every scar a teacher. It wasn't enough to be skilled. They had to be precise, ruthless, and silent about their pain. Their masters offered no comfort, only challenges. No one cared how tired they were. No one cared how badly they bled. In war, they would face worse. This was only the beginning. By 16, a squire had seen death up close, sometimes in tournaments, sometimes on the battlefield if they were unlucky or lucky depending on how you viewed it. A knight might take his squire to war not out of trust, but to toughen him up, or to test if he would break. A squire had to follow, not question, retrieve weapons mid-fight, tend to wounds, watch their mentors die. It was a cruel lesson, one that blood taught faster than any lecture. When a squire stood among corpses, the illusion shattered. Knighthood was not glory. It was horror, barely masked by oaths and ceremony. Yet still they pressed on, because to turn back meant disgrace, and disgrace meant ruin. Nobles without honor were cast out, mocked, or married off in shame. So the squire endured. He swallowed the bile in his throat, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and kept training. Every moment brought him closer, closer to the day he would wear iron like skin. Ceremony came last. When a squire finally proved his worth, through skill, service, and survival, he was called before the court. But this moment, grand as it seemed, was more symbolic than it was triumphant. The dubbing ceremony, often imagined as noble and proud, was simply another test. One final chance to stand still as a sword touched both shoulders. One final vow spoken aloud. And even then, the transformation was not magical. A knight was born in blood, not in rituals. What mattered most was not the audience or the title. It was the look in his master's eyes. Silent approval, the kind that only came after years of discipline, after 1,000 failures and one final success. From that moment on, the boy was no more. The blade had been forged, and yet, inside that gleaming armor, the boy still breathed. He just learned how to hide the fear better than before. The armor came with its own torment. It was not some majestic, floating set of plates. It was heavy, suffocating, metal pressed into flesh, heat built up with every step. A knight in full gear could barely mount a horse alone. Without squires of his own, he was helpless. The romantic image of a lone warrior riding through storms was a lie. Knights relied on others, armorers, cooks, servants, to function, and that dependence never truly vanished. Even the best warrior was still just a man underneath, chained to his humanity. Armor didn't make him invincible. It only delayed death. One mistake in battle and the steel would dent, crumple, crack. Every blow reminded him how fragile he really was. The clatter of his movements, once a proud rhythm, began to sound like a warning bell. And yet, he had earned the right to wear it, the right to bear its weight. That was his victory and his curse. Now came the expectations. Once knighted, a man could not afford to falter. Every action reflected on his house, his bloodline, and his king. He was watched constantly, judged silently. A knight who tripped in court was mocked. One who hesitated in battle was shamed. So he practiced until his hands bled, studied until sleep became a luxury. Even peace offered no rest. Tournaments replaced wars, but the stakes remained. Pride was a fragile thing, and defeat in front of nobles could ruin reputations faster than any sword. The knight became both symbol and shield, expected to be perfect, even when wounded inside. His world was no longer just about survival. It was performance, a stage where missteps had real consequences. He had power now, yes, but with power came pressure, and pressure had its own blade, always poised to strike. Not all knights came from noble roots, though most did. Some clawed their way up through blood and luck. Rare but not impossible. A commoner might prove himself in battle and be knighted on the field, but such stories were more exception than rule. For most, birth determined the path. Yet nobility alone guaranteed nothing. A cowardly heir might still fail. A weak son might be sent home in disgrace. The system was cruel by design. It demanded perfection and punished those who fell short. Even noble-born squires were often treated with scorn until they proved themselves. No one cared about your name when the sword was raised. Only your skill mattered, and your will. Those who lacked either found themselves pushed aside, forgotten. The battlefield had no room for hesitation, and neither did the training yard. To survive, a knight had to become more than a man. He had to become the weapon. The bond between squire and knight was often deeper than blood. For years, the squire shadowed his master, watched him eat, sleep, bleed. He saw the man behind the armor, the exhaustion, the doubt. He learned how to swing a blade, but also how to hold a gaze, how to hide weakness, how to lead. Many squires cried in secret. Some ran away. A few even took their own lives. The pressure was immense, the path unforgiving. But for those who endured, something unbreakable formed. Loyalty born of suffering. Brotherhood forged in silence. When the day came to kneel and be dubbed, many wept, not out of joy but relief. They had survived what others had not. And behind them, the ghosts of failed squires lingered like shadows, reminders of how easily it could have ended differently. Even after earning the title, a knight's journey never truly ended. The armor changed, the weapons improved, but the fear remained. The fear of failure, of dishonor, of dying alone in some forgotten field. A knight could win a dozen battles and still be cast aside after one mistake. Respect was earned daily, never guaranteed. And so, many knights kept training, kept pushing. They relived their squirehood each morning, as if afraid it would all be taken away, because deep down they knew the truth. They were only as good as their last fight, and in a world that praised strength above all, they could never afford to grow soft. Even peace became a battle, to stay relevant, to stay strong, to stay worthy of the name they had bled to earn. In the end, becoming a knight was not about the sword, or the ceremony, or even the armor. It was about transformation. The death of boyhood, the forging of something harder, colder, more disciplined than instinct allowed. A knight was a symbol, yes, but also a survivor, a creation of countless cuts, bruises, and broken dreams. The world saw the polished steel and cheered, but beneath it stood a man who had suffered for every inch of metal he wore, who had learned pain like scripture, and who knew, better than anyone, that the road to knighthood was paved with sacrifice. Behind the armor there was always a cost, and every knight carried that burden with every step. The journey of a knight did not begin with glory. It began with pain, and yet those who endured it became something more than men. They became legends not because they sought fame, but because they learned to survive the crucible. Chapter by chapter, we will peel back more layers. But for now, remember this: no knight was born a hero. He was forged inch by inch, scar by scar, in a world that demanded everything and gave back almost nothing. Chapter 2: Bonds of Blood. War changed a man, but it also revealed him. When the drums beat and the banners rose, knights marched not as solitary figures of legend, but as part of something far more intimate, a brotherhood forged in mud, steel, and silence. The battlefield did not reward ego, punished it, and in that brutal clarity, men learned to rely on each other more than themselves. Around the campfire, names were forgotten and titles stripped away. What mattered was who stood beside you when arrows fell, who helped lift you when your legs failed, who didn't run when death came howling through the trees. Bonds formed not through ceremony, but through shared fear, laughter in the cold, bread broken by bloodied hands, whispers exchanged in tents before dawn. A knight was taught to fight alone, but he lived only because others stood with him. And when one fell, a piece of the others fell with him. The campaign life offered no comfort. Roads vanished into marsh. Rain soaked through cloaks and skin. The scent of unwashed bodies clung to everything. And yet, amidst the filth, something sacred grew. Each morning they woke to the same dread. Each night they collapsed under the same stars. There was no room for masks, no place to hide weakness. When the fighting started, men screamed for their mothers. Some wept, some laughed, some prayed, though few believed. But afterward, they sat together in silence, blood caking their armor, eyes hollow from what they'd seen. That silence said more than words, said, I was there, I saw, I survived, and so did you. From those moments, brotherhood was born, not from vows but from memory, the kind of memory that seared itself into bone and refused to fade. Every battle deepened the connection, and every loss carved another wound that only the living could carry. Mess lines became rituals, bread passed hand to hand, a flask offered without a word. These gestures became more than survival, they were loyalty carved into routine. Within the ranks, veterans looked after the younger knights. They taught them when to rest, how to eat without gagging, where to stand when catapults began to fire. They were rough teachers, but the lessons stuck. And when those same mentors bled out beside them on the field, it broke something inside. Brotherhood meant grief, too. There were always empty bedrolls by morning. Sometimes a man's armor was left propped beside the fire, untouched. Everyone knew what it meant. No one spoke of it. They couldn't, because they had to ride again, march again, kill again. The line between survival and despair was razor thin. What held it together was each other. That unspoken oath that they would return together or die trying. Rituals extended beyond campfires. Before every battle, certain knights knelt together, not in prayer but to share tokens, a lock of hair, a carved coin, a charm passed from father to son. It was not about superstition. It was about memory. If one fell, the others would remember, would carry that piece home. Some knights etched names into their blades, not of enemies, but of comrades lost. Their weapons became grave markers, their shields memorials. The longer a knight served, the heavier his gear became, not from weight, but from history. Every dent told a story, every scar whispered a name, and the bond between brothers was more than trust. It was obligation, You owed your life to the man beside you, and he owed you the same. This was not friendship. It was something deeper, something forged in fire and kept alive by grief. No knight ever stood alone. Even in death, he stood with his brothers. But there were darker rituals too, the kind no priest blessed. After battles, some knights vanished into the woods, not to pray, but to scream, to beat their fists against trees, to dig shallow graves for comrades and bury tokens with trembling hands. No one asked where they went. No one followed, everyone understood. In silence they mourned. In silence they returned. Some carved marks into their armor, one for each friend lost. Others carried stained banners that fluttered in the wind long after their owners were gone. The bonds of brotherhood didn't break with death. They hardened, solidified into something eternal. A knight who lost too many friends stopped speaking altogether, not out of cruelty, but because language no longer carried enough weight. The memories lived behind his eyes, beyond words. And those who had seen what he had understood that silence was not emptiness. It was sacred, a vow to never forget. In battle, brotherhood became instinct. You covered your comrade's flank without thinking. You dragged him from the mud even as arrows rained down. You fought harder because you knew he was watching. Not the commander, not the king, him. The one who had bled beside you in a ditch. The one who had cried when you took a blade to the gut. The one who swore he'd carry your sword home if you didn't make it. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about honor, the kind no herald spoke of. The kind earned in split-second choices that determined life or death. If a knight betrayed that trust, it was unforgivable. Not just shameful, damnable, because betrayal didn't just kill. It desecrated the bond. And no knight wanted to die with that stain. Loyalty on the battlefield wasn't a strategy. It was the only thing that made the horror bearable. When the fighting stopped, the bonds endured. Many knights returned home bearing more than wounds. They carried names etched in memory. And sometimes those names followed them. The families of fallen comrades became their own. Widows received food, sons were trained, daughters were protected. A brother's duty did not end with burial. It lived on in quiet visits and secret gifts. Some knights never married, haunted by vows they made at dying beds. Others kept relics, daggers, scraps of cloth, even bones. Grim, perhaps, but real, because remembrance was sacred. The battlefield had taken much, but it had given one thing, a clarity that most men never found. A bond that made all the suffering, all the fear, all the loss, somehow bearable. That was the paradox. War was hell, but within its furnace, something pure was forged, something stronger than armor, stronger than steel, brotherhood. In rare moments of peace, old knights gathered in silence. They did not boast. They did not reminisce for glory. Instead, they passed around shared silences, broken only by the clink of cups or the shuffle of boots. When one spoke, the others listened. Not out of obligation, but reverence, because the voice of a comrade was sacred, and each word carried the weight of the dead. In these circles there were no ranks, no titles, just survivors, warriors bound not by blood, but by something far more enduring. Some wore fragments of fallen friends' armor, blending pieces into their own. It made them heavier, slower, but they refused to let go. Each piece was a tether to a memory they refused to bury. In these quiet hours, the mask of the knight slipped. What remained was the man underneath, hardened, broken, whole only because he had others to lean on. But brotherhood was not always clean. Sometimes it was brutal. If one knight betrayed another, left him to die, stole from him, dishonored the bond, it could spark vengeance fiercer than any war. Duels were fought not over land or title, but betrayal of brotherhood. These were not legal affairs. They were personal reckonings. And sometimes the knight who committed the offense chose death over living with shame. There were no judges for these moments, only silence. And afterward, the survivors spoke even less than before. Because once the bond was broken, it could never be mended. That was the price of loyalty. It demanded everything, and it took everything. Some knights spent their final years wandering, not because they had no home, but because their home had been buried with the men they once called brothers. They rode from village to village, searching not for peace, but for a face they'd never see again. Even the enemy sometimes became part of this strange bond. In long campaigns, knights faced the same foes again and again. They came to recognize faces, patterns, habits. There was respect in that. When a worthy foe fell, some knights wept, not because they missed him, but because something essential had been lost. In rare cases, enemies spared each other. In others, they exchanged relics, silent offerings of shared humanity, because in the end, the line between brother and foe blurred. All were men, all bled, all cried for the same things in the dark. And the battlefield revealed that truth more clearly than any priest ever could. In the roar of battle, in the screams of the dying, in the final breath of a fallen knight, brotherhood was the only constant, the only shield that could not be broken. And in that bond, they found the strength to keep riding forward. The myth of the lone knight persisted, the solitary hero, the wandering sword. But those who wore the armor knew better. They knew that behind every knight stood 10 others, unseen but never absent. Brothers who shaped him, shielded him, bled for him. The stories never mentioned them, but the knights never forgot. Every charge, every clash, every victory, they carried their brothers with them, not just in memory, but in movement, in instinct, in heart. For those who had walked through fire together, nothing could ever separate them. Even death. Brotherhood was not an idea. It was a living force, a heartbeat that echoed through every generation of knights. And long after the banners faded, long after the bones turned to dust, that heartbeat remained. Quiet, steady, eternal. That, above all, was what it meant to be a knight. Not the armor, not the title, but the brother who never left your side. Chapter 3: The Weight of Honor. A knight's sword did not only cut through flesh. It carved through duty, pride, and the unyielding expectations of a code that held no mercy. Chivalry sounded noble in stories, but for those who lived by it, it was a chain wrapped tight around the soul. Knights were expected to be more than warriors. They were guardians of virtue, justice, and discipline. But one wrong word, one ill-timed decision, and their honor could crumble in an instant. It didn't matter how many battles they had won. Honor was fragile, and once stained, it was nearly impossible to clean. A knight might spend years building his name, only to lose it in a single duel. or worse, in a single moment of hesitation. The code was clear: protect the weak, serve with loyalty, fight with valor. But the world was never so simple, and too often, knights found themselves trapped between what was right and what was expected. Every knight swore an oath, but oaths did not always align with the heart. A knight might be ordered to punish peasants for disobedience, even if their cries were just, or to support a lie spun by his liege, knowing silence made him complicit. Refusing meant rebellion, obeying meant shame. The code of chivalry offered no space for gray, and yet the world was nothing but gray. Some knights broke, others bent. A few stood firm and paid the price: exile, dishonor, or death. It was not uncommon for a knight to duel a fellow brother over a perceived slight.
Honor demanded satisfaction.
And in these personal duels, the stakes were absolute. There was no mercy.
No surrender.
The victor stood tall. The loser bled out, alone in a quiet field. Even friendships were not safe. A jest taken the wrong way could ignite a feud. Brotherhood ended where honor began. Sometimes the code itself was weaponized. Lords used it to control their knights. Rivals twisted it to ruin reputations. If a knight declined a challenge, he was branded a coward. If he accepted, he risked his life. There was no way to win, and yet he had to play the game, because stepping outside it meant being cast out. A knight without honor was worse than a beggar. He was an outcast, shunned by court, despised by former comrades. The shame clung to him, louder than any herald's cry. Whispers followed wherever he went. Children mocked him, women turned away, and worse still, his family carried the stain. A dishonored knight doomed not just himself, but his bloodline. That fear kept many silent, kept them obedient, even when justice demanded otherwise. The code became a leash, and behind every noble deed was a man wondering if he could keep living with himself. Yet some knights held the code close like a shield. They believed in it, truly. They saw chivalry as a light in a dark world. These men did not compromise. They helped the poor, defended the helpless, and refused to serve corrupt lords. And often they were the first to fall, because purity made you predictable. Predictability made you vulnerable. Honor also dictated how a knight treated prisoners, civilians, and foes. In theory, he showed mercy to those who yielded. In practice, that mercy came with a cost: ransom, humiliation, or eternal servitude. Knights were not always kind to those they spared, and sometimes they spared no one at all. In the heat of battle, the line between mercy and vengeance blurred. Some knights executed surrendered enemies if they saw them as traitors. Others slaughtered entire villages to send a message. Yet their actions were justified under twisted interpretations of the code. Honor became a mask behind which cruelty hid. But the truth always returned in the dead of night. Knights relived the screams, the pleading, the horror. No code could silence memory. And those who had bent it too far often found themselves waking in sweat, haunted by the faces of those they were supposed to protect. One of the cruelest demands of honor was blood vengeance. If a knight's kin were slain, he was expected to avenge them, even if that meant war, even if it meant killing a man he once called friend. Blood feuds erupted between noble houses, sparked by a single insult or a spilled cup. The code did not forgive insult. It demanded redress, And in seeking justice, knights often tore their own world apart. Entire castles burned for one man's honor. Hundreds died for a wounded pride. The madness spread like fire, unstoppable once lit. And when the smoke cleared, the surviving knights stood in ash, wondering if anything had been gained. Yet the next generation followed the same path, because tradition was stronger than reason, and honor, once invoked, could not be ignored. It was a curse passed from father to son. Jousting was often seen as a sport, but it was also a battlefield for honor. Knights tested their skill and pride in front of nobles and crowds. A single loss could ruin a man's reputation. A single win could elevate him for life. The pressure was immense. Some tampered with weapons. Others bribed judges. Yet all swore they competed for glory, not gain. A lie everyone accepted, because the illusion had to be maintained. Knights needed the crowd's awe, the court's favor. Without it, they were nothing. So they played the game, smiling through pain, saluting even as ribs cracked beneath their armor. The arena became another theater of honor. But behind the cheers, there was always fear. One misstep, one fall, and everything could be lost. Not just status, but identity. Because without honor, what was a knight? In moments of peace, the code turned inward. Knights examined their own thoughts, their intentions. Had they fought justly? Had they upheld their vow? This reflection could torment them, because even the most righteous had regrets. A man could do all the right things and still feel shame, could follow every rule and still cause harm. Chivalry promised clarity, but delivered confusion. And in the silence of their chambers, knights asked questions they dared not speak aloud. Did I serve the right cause? Did I kill for justice or convenience? The code had no answers. It only demanded obedience. And for many, that obedience became a burden too heavy to bear. They wore their titles like chains, smiled when they wanted to scream, and aged not from battle but from the weight of expectation. Stories often speak of honor as a shining force, but for knights it was rarely bright. It was shadowed, twisted, a maze of choices with no clear exit. Even those who mastered it lived in fear of slipping. One scandal, one accusation, and the fall was swift. Knights who once stood proudly at the king's side were seen groveling. Some knights faked their honor. They mastered the gestures, the phrases, the posture of virtue. But behind closed doors, they were merciless. Their swords served coin, not kings. And yet they thrived, because the court valued performance more than substance. A knight who appeared honorable was more useful than one who truly was. And so deception spread like rot. Those who truly lived the code became outnumbered, isolated. Some faded into obscurity. Others rebelled and paid the price. The illusion of chivalry remained, but inside the order began to crack. A knight might wonder if he still believed in anything at all, or if he, too, had become just another mask, another actor in a play with no honest script. Still, there were those who held fast, who refused to let go. They may not have been the loudest or most praised, but they were the foundation. Knights who chose the hard road, who upheld their vows even when it cost them everything. Their names rarely made songs, but they lived and died with integrity. And in quiet corners of the world, their stories were whispered with reverence. These knights proved that honor, though rare, was not extinct. It was scarred, yes, complicated but not gone. In them the code still lived, not as a weapon, but as a compass, and though they bore its weight alone, they carried it proudly, because for them, being a knight was never about glory. It was about standing firm when everyone else had learned to kneel. Chapter 4: Masks Behind the Joust. The battlefield was not the only place where knights fought. Inside glittering courts and gilded halls, a more treacherous war unfolded. One fought with smiles, silence, and secrets. The knight who triumphed in the arena had only crossed the first threshold. To survive the world of nobles, alliances, and ambition, he had to learn a second language: politics. It began with tournaments, public displays of strength cloaked in spectacle. But behind the cheers and colors, every joust was a message. Each blow was aimed not only at a rival's shield, but at his reputation, his alliances, his status in court. Knights became pawns, symbols of power moved by the unseen hands of lords and ladies. And while the people saw pageantry, the knights saw peril. One wrong gesture, one defeat too many, and the knight could be discarded, ridiculed, or worse, used. The court demanded performance, not just on horseback, but in every word and every breath. In courtly life, nothing was given freely. Favor had a price. A glance from a powerful lady might lift a knight's fortunes, or destroy them. Whispered flattery could open doors, but a single misstep could seal them shut. The knight was expected to charm, obey, and fight, all while pretending he didn't notice the invisible blades aimed at his back. Nobles smiled as they schemed. Lords made promises they never meant to keep. A knight could be elevated to hero one day and declared a traitor the next. Reputation was fragile, and envy never slept. Even among allies there were traps, hidden debts, secret tests of loyalty. Some knights played the game well, learning how to read eyes instead of words, how to mask their thoughts behind carefully chosen silences. Others stumbled, confused by a world where truth meant nothing and appearance meant everything. The court was a performance, one that never ended. Tournaments became stages of manipulation. Lords sponsored their favorites, showered them with gold, arranged their pairings. Victories were not always earned with skill. Sometimes they were bought. A knight who refused to play along could find himself mysteriously uninvited. His name erased from rosters, his opponents suddenly far stronger than expected. Behind the fanfare, money changed hands. Deals were struck. Secrets whispered into gloved ears. Some knights traded honor for advancement. Others clung to principle and fell into obscurity. But all of them knew the tournament grounds were not just sand and banners. They were battlegrounds of influence. Winning meant more than prestige, it meant power. And power in court could keep a man alive, or make him a target. Even the bravest warriors found themselves defenseless against the quiet cruelty of a noble's whisper. Some knights became agents of their lords, sent not to fight, but to spy. These were not assassins in the shadows. They wore armor, bore crests, and smiled in the light. But their true weapons were secrets. They gathered whispers, seduced courtiers, eavesdropped on strategy sessions. And when necessary, they delivered quiet threats with velvet tones. If they were caught, they denied everything. Their status shielded them, but their souls carried the weight. Knights trained for war, not deception. Yet the court demanded more. A trusted knight could be ordered to follow a rival lord, to seduce a widow, to provoke a duel on behalf of his master's pride. And each task pulled him further from the code he once swore to uphold. Some justified their actions. Others broke quietly. Either way, they learned one truth. In the court, the blade was never the deadliest weapon. Words were. There were always eyes watching, servants listening behind tapestries, rivals hiding behind grins. A knight had to master not only warfare, but theater. His armor became his costume, his smile his shield. He bowed with grace, spoke with care, and hid his anger beneath polished manners. But rage simmered, betrayal festered, and the deeper he walked into the web of courtly politics, the more tangled he became. Friendships were forged and broken in a single evening. Alliances made over wine were destroyed before sunrise. Even a feast could become dangerous. A poisoned cup, a slipped insult, a trap disguised as a toast. The knight who had survived war now faced a new battlefield. And here there were no rules, only winners and corpses, some still breathing. Love was not spared from courtly games. A knight's affection could be exploited. A mistress could be used to extract secrets. A noble's daughter might be promised as reward, only to be taken away the next day. Emotions were tools in this world, leverage, not luxury. Some knights swore never to love again after being used. Others hardened, turning their hearts to stone. But the court had a way of testing every vow. Jealous rivals might expose old affairs. Spurned lovers could become deadly enemies. And through it all, the knight had to smile, had to nod, had to keep playing the game, because showing emotion meant weakness. And in the court, weakness was blood in the water. Not all knights survived their time in the court. Some were disgraced, accused of treason by jealous lords. Others were sent on impossible missions, framed for failure. A few vanished, their names erased from records, their families silenced. Justice was rare, retribution swift. The code of chivalry meant little here. What mattered was leverage, connection, the ability to disappear a rival with a rumor. And so the wise knight learned caution. He trusted few, spoke little, watched always. His sword stayed sharp, but his tongue sharper, because one wrong conversation could end him faster than any blade ever could. For those who played the game well, the rewards were immense. Lands, titles, access to the king's ear. A knight who navigated court politics could rise higher than any battlefield could take him. Some even married into royalty, became governors, advisors, power brokers in their own right. But every step up came with a cost. More enemies, more lies, more chances to fall. And the higher a knight climbed, the further he had to fall. Some chose to step away before it consumed them. Others stayed, and let it devour what little of them remained. In the end, courtly success was a blade with two edges. It dazzled, but it cut deep. The court changed knights. Even those who entered with pure hearts emerged colder, more guarded. They learned that truth could be twisted, that honor could be mocked, that loyalty could be purchased. And still they returned, because they had to. Their futures, their names, their families all depended on favor, and favor lived in the court. So they endured, they played the role, wore the armor, bowed, smiled, and survived. But deep inside, a part of them longed for the clarity of the battlefield. The chaos of combat was honest. Courtly intrigue was not. It was slow poison, and it left no scars you could see. There were rare moments when masks slipped. When a knight sat alone in a shadowed alcove, staring at his reflection in a silver goblet, wondering who he had become, remembering the boy who trained in the mud, the warrior who fought beside brothers in blood. And now, here he was, fencing with words, dancing with deception, choking on silk and expectation. Some broke then, others buried that part of themselves. But all of them knew the court did not want knights. It wanted pawns that looked like knights. And to survive, they had to become exactly that. And yet, for all its darkness, the court was inescapable. It was the heart of power, the center of every campaign, every alliance, every war. A knight who ignored it was a knight left behind. So they sharpened their minds alongside their blades. They learned to lie without blinking, to strike without raising a sword, to kill with a whisper. This was not betrayal of their calling, it was evolution. The battlefield had changed, and the knight had to change with it, or vanish. Behind the glory and grandeur, behind the cheers and ceremonies, there were shadows. And within those shadows walked knights who had once dreamed only of honor. Now they dreamed of survival. The armor still gleamed, the banners still flew, but inside the man had changed. The court had seen to that, not with steel but with secrets, and in that war the scars never faded. Chapter 5: Hearts Beneath Helmets. Behind the roar of battle and the cold gleam of steel, there were softer sounds. Quiet promises, hidden letters, the size of hearts pulled in two directions. Knights swore their lives to both lady and liege, but loyalty to love was rarely simple. A knight was expected to be strong, honorable, and detached. Yet beneath the armor beat a heart no less human than the farmer's or the bard's. Love for a knight was dangerous, not just because it made him vulnerable, but because it complicated everything. Political marriages crushed personal desire. Secret affairs could ruin reputations. And emotions, when tangled with duty, led to impossible choices. The songs told of noble devotion, but they left out the grief, the betrayal, the longing that never faded. In truth, love was not a reward for the knight. It was another battlefield, and one he could not win with strength alone. Many knights met love while serving in courts. Daughters of nobles, widowed countesses, even serving women behind castle walls. Affection blossomed in stolen glances during feasts or whispered conversations during long patrols. But rarely was it allowed to grow. Marriages were tools of alliance, not matters of the heart. A knight's affection, if exposed, could be used against him. A rival might spread rumors. A jealous lord might threaten punishment. Even a minor affair could lead to disgrace or exile. And still they fell in love. Some wrote poems in secret. Others carried locks of hair under their armor. A few risked everything for a midnight embrace. But love demanded more than passion. It demanded sacrifice. And the higher the stakes, the more dangerous it became. Knights learned to hide their feelings behind practiced smiles and rigid formality, because even the gentlest affection could shatter everything they had sworn to protect. For those already bound by marriage, love carried different burdens. Many knights married for status or duty, not desire. Their wives were chosen by lords, not hearts. Some grew into love, others grew apart. But when the knight rode off to war, he left behind more than a household. He left behind a life, a woman who waited in fear, children who counted the days. Letters became lifelines, though many never arrived. Some knights never returned. Others came back changed, haunted, broken, strangers in their own homes. Reunions were not always joyful. Sometimes they were silent, filled with the pain of lost time. Love tested by distance, by blood, by memory, and in that distance, some knights found comfort in other arms. They justified it as survival, as escape, but the guilt followed, especially when they looked into the eyes of the ones they left behind. A knight's heart could also be broken by grief. On campaign, messages from home were feared as much as welcomed. News of a child's death, a wife's illness, a burned village. These letters struck harder than any sword. And yet the knight had to carry on, had to ride, fight, kill while his soul cracked beneath the weight. There were no mourning periods in war, no time to grieve. Some nights broke, others buried the pain so deep it poisoned them. They wore masks of strength, laughed louder, fought harder. But at night, when the fires died and the silence grew, their tears fell unseen into the earth. Love, once a strength, became a wound, a reminder of what they had lost or might lose still. And in every charge into battle, they prayed not just for victory, but for the chance to return, to hold what mattered most one more time. Love was also used as a weapon. A knight's affection could be twisted by powerful lords or cunning ladies, a false promise of marriage, a manipulated confession, a seduction meant to control, not comfort. Some knights were lured into scandal. Others were blackmailed into betrayal. A letter discovered, a secret exposed, a mistress turned spy. In these games, love was not tender, it was lethal. And the knight, trained in combat but not deceit, often found himself outmatched, betrayed by the very heart he thought safe. These wounds did not bleed, but they festered, and many knights learned, too late, that the heart was more vulnerable than flesh. Some swore off love entirely, became cold, distant, unreachable. But even those who claimed to have buried it still flinched at a familiar scent, a familiar laugh, the ghost of what once was or what could never be. Not all love stories ended in ruin. Some nights did find joy brief, fragile, fiercely protected. A wife who waited with unwavering faith. Children who ran to greet a bloodied father. Moments of peace stolen between campaigns. A kiss before battle. A letter treasured in a leather pouch. These were not grand tales sung by minstrels, but they were real, and they sustained men through the darkest days. Because love, even fleeting, gave meaning to the chaos. It reminded the knight that he was more than a weapon, more than a title. He was a man, and somewhere, someone loved him not for his victories, but for the soul beneath the scars. These quiet loves were the ones that endured, that anchored a night when everything else was lost. And for some, they were the only reason to keep going. But even these pure loves were threatened by war. A knight could be gone for years. Whole lives passed in his absence. Children grew without him. Wives learned to live alone. And when he returned, the world had changed. He no longer fit. He spoke of battlefields and death while his family spoke of harvests and storms. The gap widened. Familiar rooms felt foreign. Home became a memory, not a refuge. Some nights left again, unable to bear the stillness. Others stayed silent, watching life go on without them. The love was still there, but love was not always enough to heal what time had fractured. And the knight, who once charged into enemy lines without fear, now feared something greater, being forgotten, being left behind by those he fought so hard to return to. Knights also loved each other, though such bonds could never be spoken aloud. In war, lines between camaraderie and affection blurred. Some knights formed bonds deeper than brotherhood. They shared more than blades and blood. They shared dreams, pain, laughter. These were not always romantic, but they were real. And when one died, the other mourned like a widower. These loves were hidden behind rituals, a hand on a shoulder, a shared watch beneath the stars. In a world that demanded silence, these small acts were everything. Because to care that deeply, in a world that could snatch life away without warning, was rebellion. It defied the brutality of their world. And even in the silence, these loves mattered. They gave color to a world of gray. And for those lucky enough to feel them, they left marks no blade could erase. Some knights found love not in people, but in places. In a quiet grove near home, in the smell of hay in the stables, in the rhythm of a horse's hooves. These small comforts became sanctuaries. When everything else was war and blood, these familiar sights and sounds reminded them they were still human. They loved their swords, yes, but also the feel of leather reins, the warmth of the sun on their backs. Love, in this way, became survival. It was found in stillness, in routine, in the moments between battles. And though these loves were not sung, they were cherished, because in a world that demanded everything from a knight, even the smallest joy was worth clinging to. Even the cruelest knights carried some love inside them. For a mother, a brother, a fallen comrade. No man could be so hardened that love did not touch him. And often it was that love that made him cruel. Fear of losing it, rage at having lost it already. Love twisted by grief became vengeance. Love denied became fury. And in this way, love shaped the battlefield as much as any sword. It drove men to fight harder. Tu di brava, to sacrifice more than they ever thought possible. And sometimes it saved them, pulled them back from the brink, gave them a reason to lower their blade. Even the fiercest warrior, at his darkest hour, might hear the voice of someone he loved and stop. So when we speak of knights, let us not speak only of armor, banners, and blood. Let us remember the letters stained with tears, the names whispered before sleep, the hands reached for in the dark. Behind every visor was a heart that loved, longed, and lost. And though history remembers the wars they fought, it too often forgets the love they carried. A love that was never simple, never safe, but always real, always human. And in the end, perhaps it was that love, not the sword, that made a knight truly noble. Chapter 6. Into the Iron Storm. When the banners rose and the horns blew across the fields, a knight knew the hour had come. No more tournaments, no more practice drills. This was real war, mud, blood, and the sharp edge of mortality. For all their training, nothing fully prepared them for the roar of combat, the clatter of armor, the weight of fear in their gut. The first time a lance struck true and a comrade fell. It was nothing like the songs. It wasn't clean, it wasn't noble, it was chaos. Riders screamed, horses bucked. Men vanished beneath piles of bodies. A knight could be proud, armored, and ready, and still die in the first charge. There was no guarantee of glory. Only the cold reality that death might come before honor ever had the chance. And when it came, it was often fast. A flash of metal, a scream, then silence. One moment of distraction was all it took. Before battle, knights gathered in quiet circles. They prayed, tightened straps, exchanged silent nods. Some whispered their family names, holding onto the thought of home. Others kept a lucky charm close, an old ribbon, a carved stone, a scrap of cloth. There was no bravado now, only the tension of knowing what lay ahead. Veterans did not boast. They had seen too much. They had heard the screams of friends and smelled burning flesh. They understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was riding forward despite it. Younger knights trembled. Older ones wore stone faces. Every man imagined where his body might fall, and who would carry news to his family if he never returned. The stillness before the charge was its own kind of agony. Time stretched. Every heartbeat thundered like a drum. And then, with a single shouted command, the world erupted. Lances leveled. Horses surged forward. The ground shook beneath the weight of 100 riders charging as one. For a few seconds it felt like flying. The wind in your ears, the roar in your chest, then impact, the jolt when lance met shield, the cracking of bone, the wheeze of breath knocked from lungs. Many knights never made it past the first strike. Unhorsed, trampled, speared before they could even draw a sword. For those who stayed mounted, the charge splintered into pockets of hand-to-hand combat. Gone were the lines of battle. Gone was the plan. There was only instinct. Swing, parry, duck, strike again, armor dented. Blood seeped between plates. Screams mingled with steel on steel. The knight who could not think quickly died quickly, and even the skilled had no control over the arrow fired from across the field. Death came from every direction. Battles were not short. Some dragged on for hours. Others turned to days of skirmishes. Knights fought until their arms went numb, until their horses collapsed from exhaustion. Helmets fogged with sweat. Fingers slipped on blood-slicked hilts. A knight learned to ignore pain, to fight through slashed legs, broken ribs, split brows. There was no pause, no timeout. If you stopped, you died. Many fought without knowing who the enemy was. In the chaos, banners were torn, colors mixed, allies looked like foes. Some knights killed their own men by mistake. Others were cut down while trying to save a friend. The battlefield did not forgive confusion. It devoured the unsure and left no space for regret. Those who survived did so with luck as much as skill. And when the horns finally called for retreat, the silence that followed felt like waking from a nightmare. But not all battles were fought on open ground. Some were sieges, long, brutal affairs where death came slowly. A knight trapped in a fortress faced hunger, disease, and the unrelenting dread of collapse. Arrows rained from towers. Boiling oil poured from walls. Tunnels were dug beneath foundations. Night never felt safe. Every sound could mean an attack. Inside the walls, tempers flared. Supplies ran low. Wounded moaned through the night. A siege did not just test strength. It tested patience, spirit, and sanity. Some knights deserted. Others snapped under pressure. A few became legends, rallying their men in impossible conditions. But all carried the same question: how long could they hold? And when would the final breach come? The end was never clean. Came with fire, with screams, with the gates shattered and the enemy flooding in. In those moments there was no code, only survival. Knights were trained to fight, but nothing prepared them for the smell of war. Victory was rarely what it seemed. After the banners were raised and the enemy fled, there were bodies to bury, wounded to tend, ruins to walk through. Fields were soaked red. Cities smoldered. Survivors wandered aimlessly. A knight might stand victorious, but wonder if it had been worth the cost. Sometimes the reward was land, title, gold. Other times it was just another order to march. There was no real celebration, only preparation for the next fight. Some knights drank to forget. Others prayed. A few walked away altogether, but most stayed, because war was all they knew. Peace felt foreign. Their hands remembered the feel of a sword better than a lover's touch. And so, when the next horn blew, they mounted up again. Not because they wanted to, but because they no longer knew how not to. Wounds did not always come from blades. A knight might lose a limb, an eye, his voice. He might return home unable to ride or lift a sword. Some never healed. Others wore their scars like armor, hiding pain behind gritted teeth. There were no medals for suffering, only the slow fade of usefulness. A knight who could not fight became a shadow. Some turned to teaching, training new squires in hopes that the next generation would endure what they could not. Others sank into silence, haunted by screams only they could hear. The battlefield took more than life, took identity, and once stripped of armor, many knights didn't know who they were anymore. What was left of the man when the fighting stopped? There were moments of mercy in the madness. Fallen foe spared. A wounded man carried back to camp. Even among the horror, some knights clung to humanity. These small acts of grace became legends. A hand extended instead of a blade. A prayer whispered over an enemy's body. These moments reminded knights that they were not monsters. Not yet. They fought for kings, for land, for honor, but sometimes they simply fought to protect the man next to them. That bond, born in blood and fire, was stronger than any oath. It kept them from losing themselves completely, and in the darkest hours it reminded them why they fought at all. And still there was glory, not in the songs, not in the stories, but in the sheer will to rise again, to face the charge, to defend the weak, to ride into death knowing what it meant. That courage, the kind that endures despite the fear, despite the pain, that was the true glory of a knight. Not the cheers of a crowd, not the polished armor, but the silent strength that pushed him forward, again and again, even when his body begged him to stop. That was what made a knight more than a warrior. It made him a legend. War stripped away pretense. It revealed who a knight truly was. Under the banners, beyond the codes, past the pomp, there was only one question. Would he stand or would he break? And for those who stood, again and again, through fire and blood, history would remember their courage. Not the details, not the politics, but the fact that they were there, in the iron storm, holding the line, refusing to fall. And in that refusal, they became immortal. Chapter 7. Beneath the Shining Lies. When the trumpets faded and the crowds dispersed, a heavy silence fell. The armor was polished, the banners folded, but beneath the sheen of glory, something lingered. Not pride, not victory, something darker. This was the part of a knight's life that no song dared sing. The part left out of history scrolls and heroic tales. Behind every glorious charge, there were nightmares. Behind every victory feast, there were bandaged wounds and empty chairs. The truth most knights carried with them was not the thrill of battle, but the weight of survival. They endured not because they were fearless, but because they were trained to hide fear behind iron. The final mask a knight wore wasn't forged in steel. It was silence, a silence thick with pain, questions, and memories that refused to fade. This was the hidden truth, the secret cost, the unspoken burden that followed them long after the fighting had stopped. No one spoke of the nights spent awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of a lost battle. The eyes of the dying haunted them. The groans of men they couldn't save rang louder than any battlefield cry. They had memorized the weight of a comrade's corpse. They had learned how to walk away from grief, only for it to catch them again in dreams. Many nights drank to forget. Some prayed, others simply broke, quietly, slowly, without ever saying a word. The world called them heroes, but they saw ghosts in every corner of their memory. And when asked about war, they nodded, smiled, changed the subject, because speaking it aloud would make it real again, and they could not bear to relive it, so they suffered in silence. The bravest among them were not those who fought hardest, but those who endured longest, without ever being allowed to mourn. Infections took more nights than swords. A shallow cut could rot into fever. A broken limb could fester. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia, just hot knives, biting herbs, and prayers. Amputations were common. A knight who once ruled the battlefield might return missing a leg, an arm, or his eyesight. Some learned to adapt, training with their remaining strength. Others faded into obscurity, discarded by the very lords who once praised them. They were no longer useful, no longer symbols, just broken men in quiet corners, watching the world they helped defend pass them by. Pain became their constant companion. Every step a reminder, every movement a struggle. But worse than the physical scars were the invisible ones, the shame of being forgotten, of being replaced by younger, stronger warriors. The battlefield did not pity the fallen. It moved on, and so did the world. Disease spread through camps like fire through dry grass. Plague, dysentery, fever. The close quarters of tents, shared water, and wounded bodies became breeding grounds for death. A knight might survive a siege only to die from tainted meat or unwashed hands. They saw comrades turn pale, cough blood, and waste away within days. There was no cure, only hope. Some knights kept to strict rituals of cleanliness, desperate to avoid the invisible enemy. Others simply accepted it. They had dodged arrows, swords, and fire. If death came from within, then so be it. But watching strong men die slowly left a mark. It made victory feel hollow. What was the point of surviving a war if disease waited to finish what blades could not? This was not the part of knighthood they were trained for. It was cruel, senseless, and merciless, and it reminded them that even the mightiest could be undone by a single breath. The ideals of chivalry weighed heavily over time. It demanded nobility, restraint, compassion. But war rarely allowed for those things. A knight might begin with honor in his heart and end with blood on his hands. There were moments when he had to choose mercy or survival, law or instinct. Sometimes there was no right answer, only consequences. A village burned on command, an innocent killed by accident. These were not glorious acts. They were necessary ones, or so they told themselves. But the code did not comfort them afterward. It became a mirror showing them who they were and who they had become. Some knights clung to it, hoping it would save them. Others turned away from it completely, believing the world too cruel for ideals. And in the end, most found themselves somewhere in between, torn, uncertain, and silently ashamed of the choices they had made. Many knights questioned their loyalty. They fought for kings who cared little for them. They bled for causes that shifted with each season. Alliances changed. Enemies became friends. Friends became enemies. It was hard to believe in anything solid. Some knights returned home to find the very lords they served had betrayed them, taken their land, denied their pension, rewritten the story of their service. And what could they do? They had no armies, no leverage, only memories. So they swallowed the injustice, nodded when their names were left out of records, watched as lesser men took credit. They knew the truth, but the truth meant nothing if no one listened. And that, more than anything, hollowed them out. Not the wounds, not the pain, but the feeling of being used, discarded, and forgotten. Like ghosts in their own stories, isolation followed them everywhere. Civilians could never understand. Family could not grasp the weight they carried. The world expected them to return to normal life, to forget what they had seen. But how could they? Every festival felt fake. Every feast tasted of ash. They sat through celebrations while remembering the smell of burning flesh. They held their children while hearing the cries of men dying alone in mud. Joy felt like betrayal, and so they distanced themselves. They spoke less, smiled less, became quieter, harder. Not out of anger, but out of survival, because to feel too much was to break. And knights were not allowed to break, so they built walls, not with stone but with silence. Some knights wandered after the wars, not to find new battles but to escape memory. They became mercenaries, pilgrims, monks, anything that would let them run from what they once were. A few sought redemption, others sought peace, most found neither. Because no matter where they went, they carried the battlefield with them. It was in their walk, their silence, the way they stared too long at nothing. They might wear simple robes, but the night remained beneath the fabric. Tired, scarred, lost. These were not tales of glory. They were stories of survival. Of men trying to live after being taught only how to die. And they walked roads not to find new places, but to outrun old ghosts. The people still celebrated knights. They cheered their return. They sang songs of victory, but they never asked about the parts left unsung, about the screams, the guilt, the friends left behind. Knights learned to smile and nod, to let others believe the lie. It was easier that way. No one wanted the truth. They wanted heroes shining, flawless, perfect. So the knights played the role. But inside they remembered every detail, every failure. Every time they had to close a comrade's eyes and ride on. They remembered what the songs did not. what the history books skipped, and in that quiet remembrance, they carried the real story, not of glory but of survival. In rare moments, they met others who understood. A look, a word, and the mask slipped. For a moment, they were no longer symbols, but men, bruised, broken, but real. These moments were rare, but they mattered. They reminded the knight that he was not alone, that others had also carried the same weight, that someone else knew what it meant to wake in a cold sweat, to flinch at sudden noise, to cry when no one watched. And in that shared pain there was healing, not complete, not immediate, but real. Because even if the world had moved on, even if the stories had lied, they had each other. And sometimes that was enough. So when we think of knights, let us remember not just the armor, the banners, or the shining pageants. Let us remember the scars we cannot see, the silence they were forced to bear, the truths they buried deep to keep going. Behind every gleaming visor was a soul that had endured more than we will ever know. And the greatest courage they ever showed was not in battle, but in what came after, in living on, in carrying their pain with dignity, in refusing to let the darkness win. That was the final truth, the hidden one, the one history never wrote down, but the knights never forgot, and neither should we.